Today, we are speaking with a leading semiconductor analyst, Dylan Patel, on the recent hack of NVIDIA, which he calls a national security disaster. You can subscribe to Dylan's newsletter, Semi Analysis, and he offers a detailed overview of what we're going to discuss today. We're also going to hear from Daniel Markus, who is the lead staffer at the U.S. House of Representatives China Task Force, which is headed by Texas Republican Michael McCall. Daniel has an academic background in the Chinese language, and he wrote the definitive reports for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which sounded the alarm on Chinese government's illicit practices. So, Dylan, let's start with you. You've described this recent NVIDIA hack as a national security disaster, and you write, in essence, the blueprint of these chips, the product of a $580 billion company and $300 billion of research and development, could be in the hands of hostile actors. Let's unpack that. You know, NVIDIA is a leading corporation in semiconductors. It doesn't produce the chips itself, but it designs the chips, which is actually the high end of the value chain. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about these graphics processing units, or GPUs, which NVIDIA specializes. It's considered, as you write, the sort of top end of the market for video gaming and professional workstation applications. So what happened?
Sure. So Lapsus, a hacking group, sort of black hat out of Brazil and a little bit in Portugal, was able to exploit a vulnerability related to VPNs. It was sort of a zero-day exploit, in that the exploit was already there before anyone knew it was there, and they were able to exploit that in order to gain access to NVIDIA's systems. They had access to NVIDIA's IT systems for at least a week, and they were able to extract quite a bit of data out of NVIDIA before they were caught and shut down. Um, in that hack that they were able to extract all this data, they were able to grab quite a few important things. Not only were they able to grab, all of NVIDIA's software details, right? For example, their drivers and their AI software libraries. They also were able to grab the files that are part of their chip design, right? NVIDIA is a semiconductor design firm, and their product is a design that they then hand over to a fabrication plant, and the supply chain sort of uh, orchestration that they do. And these designs that they were caught that were taken, not only include the blueprint of the design, right, but also how they arrived at that, right? So taking the blueprint of a design, right, the actual code of a design is not as valuable because it's really hard for you to just straight up copy it and tell the same fab to manufacture it again, right? That's just not going to fly. But what is really important is that the the simulations that allowed them to determine, what architecture they should design for the chip, what architecture works best for the workload that they're going for, which is, graphics and AI. That is out there. And this group, we don't know whether they kept it to themselves. They said they were just going to open source some stuff, but they also were trying to sell some of NVIDIA's software. So, odds are they probably could have sold the chip designs as well in the simulations. Um, and this data that they released is so detailed that we know exactly what NVIDIA's next generation chips will look like. That's on an architectural basis, so it's pretty mind-boggling what level of detail has gone out there.
Wow. So what you've talked about here is a zero-day attack. For those people who are not familiar with a zero-day attack, will be a vulnerability is found in a system, and it's somehow made known, and it's attacked on the day that it's made known. So it's before the company or the entity has time to repair the attack. So they exploited a vulnerability in NVIDIA's system and were there undetected. Then you describe that this hacking organization, which, by the way, apparently NVIDIA said has nothing to do with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and it's not ransomware, which we could talk about in a second. But basically, they stole essentially the blueprints, all of the valuable intellectual property about how to build their specialized chips, and made it public. There was some back and forth with this hacking company saying that they were going to make certain demands, but essentially all this valuable IP is now out there. But then what you describe as at another layer, it's not just that it's public, that there are certain actors who want to exploit this. And you say it's not the companies in the OECD countries, US, EU, Japan, and so forth, but it's really a gift to China and some other countries who want to get a leg up on semiconductors. So maybe you could talk about how would you see that playing out? Because if in fact, let's say a Chinese firm would acquire these designs, would we not be able to go and say, hey, wait a second, this looks like the leaked information from NVIDIA? How would you see that? How do you see it? Can you describe how talk about how it could be used against the U.S. or who would like to take advantage of this?
Sure. So there's a couple avenues here. One is that you're completely right. Like, right, they can't if they were to use the chip exactly, the design, one, they couldn't even get it manufactured easily, right? In terms of, TSMC is the specific fab that NVIDIA designed these chips for. And it would be clear as day, and TSMC would not allow this to be manufactured. But the learnings from looking at the design, seeing, the architectural decisions that NVIDIA made, the simulations that allowed NVIDIA to determine that this was the best possible path for their next generation chips, these are all learnings that, can be meticulously combed through and applied to your own design philosophy. Right. Part of what it makes NVIDIA, the best is not that, hey, we designed the best chip, because they release the chip and then, call it three to 5 years later, everyone else could copy those features. That's not what makes them powerful. What makes them amazing is, is that they can they can lead everyone, right? And so that's about the process, and the process is out there now, right? At least some of the tools involved in their process. So a player like InnoSilicon could, potentially look at all of these details, learn some things, and level up their knowledge base, and then be able to apply that to their own designs, right? And you would never know that they would never have copied a single aspect of NVIDIA's chips. They would have, seen all these trade secrets involved in the design of a chip, and then potentially be able to use it. And when you think about where could this be used, it could be used in quite a few places, right? One is just, China disentangling itself from the compute platforms that, the West has, such as, Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, Broadcom, Cisco, etc., right? Disentangling and not buying those chips anymore, buying their own. Sure, that's one. But two, even more threatening is on the supercomputing side, right? So China's recently built a supercomputer. It's the fastest supercomputer in the world that we know of. It's an exascale system, which the U.S. has not completed yet. Right, we're in the process of building ours. And getting it validated and such. But China's already built theirs and validated it, and they did it without even using the most advanced, 7 nanometer or 5 nanometer technologies. They did it all with indigenous 14 nanometer technologies. That SMIC, a Chinese fab can build, and Chinese companies design. Through brute force, they were able to build a system. Sure, it has twice as much power consumption as the American exascale system that we're in the process of right now. But brute force can get you a long way, and this supercomputer is going to be used for nuclear simulations and other simulations that that are not in the purview of American uh, or Western insights. So for example, the U.S. has blocked many Chinese supercomputing companies from purchasing American chips because they are connected to things such as nuclear research and nuclear weapon, details. And this allows them to do that same work without ever touching an American company. Using Chinese indigenously developed RAM, indigenously developed processors, indigenously developed networking. All of this is is possible, and this is all on 14 nanometer with a relatively poor design. You take this, and you can take these learnings and make much better chips. So the lead that the West has is definitely diminished by this hack.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple of actors in there, potential suspects who may want to get this. You talked about SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. You've talked about the supercomputer entity. I believe that's one of the military labs. I'm forgetting the name at present. Are there any other Chinese semiconductor firms that might be interested in this?
I mean, if I'm in China and if I'm developing semiconductors, it doesn't even matter if I'm developing, GPU and AI semiconductors. As long as you're not worried about the legal ramifications of having downloaded this hack, this file that's out there, you probably do, because the simulations and some of the tool chains that were put out there don't apply only to GPUs and AI silicon, but they apply beyond that. Like how much memory to put, what type of memory to put on the die, on the chip, and how to arrange that. These types of things apply to a lot more than just what NVIDIA works on. And so, I would say, it's not just, these, a company like InnoSilicon, which is working on GPUs, but it's much more beyond that. Um,
So, well, obviously, this is a critical failure. It's a terrible thing that's happened for sure. You study the sector quite a bit, and I'm sure that cybersecurity practices are in your purview. And you, of course, you talk with a lot of the semiconductor firms about their practices. I would gather they do everything possible. It's not possible to stop every attack, and some things, if they are uh, initiated by a state actor, for example, it goes beyond what companies can often do to protect themselves. In this case, it wasn't, at least we understand, that this hacker group says they're not state supported. And, I can't tell how simple this particular hack was or how complex. It's hard for me to determine that. But what is your view about the precautions taken by NVIDIA in this case? Do you think that they did everything that they could? Was this something silly? Is this an issue across the sector? Or is just, these things are going to happen? And, what's your view about that?
so cybersecurity is a touchy topic. It's virtually impossible to protect yourself entirely. The U.S. government's been hacked. NVIDIA's been hacked. It's quite a few entities that have the sophistication and means to not be hacked have been hacked. And I'm sure, you know, NSA or whoever has hacked other firms, or not other firms but other countries, right? It's just a fact of life. These zero-day exploits, you don't know they exist uh, until they happen. So it's almost impossible to actually know what to do regarding the cybersecurity issues.
Right.
The thing that is relevant is, hey, once they happen, what do we do? Um, you know, so it's happened now. Now, what is the response, right? From my understanding, this Lapsus group, was directly contacted, and they now ban any mentions of NVIDIA on their chats and their communications. They don't, they've stopped leaking. They had a threatened leak that they were going to do, I think 2 Fridays ago, and then they never did it. All because, I assume they were contacted by, some folks that are pretty powerful. So these sorts of actions need to be, well funded. What is the future? What is the defense? What is the reaction that we do on a cybersecurity, cyber warfare front? Um, right now, it's very nebulous. The government sort of doesn't have any direct funding for it, as far as I'm aware, and there's no pathways put in place. It's sort of more free scale, which maybe it does need to be free scale, because I'm sure some of the things that are needed to be done are not exactly legal in all ways, right? Even on a defense standpoint. So perhaps it just needs to involve more funding for cybersecurity directly. I'm not sure what we could do to prevent this, but the reaction is something that has to be funded and well understood.
Yes. So, well, I'm going to turn here to Daniel Markus from the China Task Force at the U.S. House of Representatives. Daniel, what's your overall reaction to the story? And, I imagine that, that you look at these kinds of threats or these risks, these situations. How does the China Task Force imagine some of these things?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Roslyn, and just want to start off by saying thanks for having me and all the great work that you guys are doing at China Tech Thread. It's an invaluable resource for folks on the Hill to understand the dynamics playing out, particularly within the competition and technology between the United States and in the PRC. And also, it's a pleasure to be here with Dylan, who also for a lot of Hill staffers subscribe to his newsletter. So he's doing great work on keeping us up to date on what's going on within the semiconductor industry. I can't necessarily speak to the specifics of this case, but maybe zooming out a little bit, the area of semiconductor architecture and open source is definitely a topic for folks on the Hill as we look at China. And I'd focus on sort of three main points. The first is the bad behavior that we've already seen of Chinese companies or companies in the PRC within this space. The intense focus that the PRC government and the party has on open source technology platforms. And finally, the legal and regulatory issues for how the US and other allies and partners might respond. In terms of the bad behavior in semiconductor architecture, your readers and listeners are likely very well aware of Sugon x86, as well as the issues surrounding ARM. So to go back, I think in a Wall Street Journal article titled, Giving Away the Keys to the Kingdom, there was a report about AMD's joint venture with Sugon in the PRC and the transfer of x86 architecture to Sugon. And what's interesting here within the context of time is Sugon was later identified as a Chinese military company. And I think as Dylan was sort of pointing out, involved in China's high performance computing space, which has had a leading role in terms of the PRC's ability to successfully test a hypersonic missile. The other case with ARM, ARM was a UK company that was eventually sold to SoftBank, who then joint ventured with PRC fund that was state backed. And through this joint venture, they were able to license the ARM architecture throughout the PRC economy. And what's notable with the ARM example is, despite the UK board firing the PRC-based CEO, to date, he refuses to relinquish legal authority over the PRC-based entity. So it's sort of an interesting sort of case study of PRC actors intensely trying to obtain this sort of technology and then use it throughout the PRC economy. And the next point is this intense focus on open source. And you look at like the 14th five-year plan, there's a lot of focus on PRC participation in foreign open source technology platforms. And for the purposes of this conversation, one of the notable ones is RISC-V. We've seen Alibaba and other Chinese companies that are actively participating in RISC-V, likely in an effort to de-link themselves from the proprietary instruction set architecture that ARM and Intel and AMD have. And they've had some successes within RISC-V of using that sort of open source architecture. And in addition to just the semiconductor space, we're also seeing it in things like 5G with the ORAN Alliance. And what's concerning here is that some of the PRC participation is among military companies. And so you have military companies that are part of these platforms. And one of the most valuable things that they stand to gain is the knowledge. And I think Dylan talked about that really well, of sort of the learning curve that they're able to obtain through these types of venues. And the final thing I'd mention is sort of, what do we do? What would a US or ally partner response be with respect to open source? And this is where it gets difficult, because currently it's outside of legal and regulatory authorities, or at least within export controls. There wouldn't be an opportunity for the US to use export controls currently to put any sort of restrictions in place here. And I think it's going to require a lot of creative thinking of how do we think through the issues within open source and protect our interests, whether the United States or a small group of like-minded allies and partners.
So, well, Daniel, thank you for that overview. I really appreciate the work of the China Task Force. There's so many good reports that you have, and you really do a good job to outline the issues and bring in all of these policy angles. So, but I think let's take a second here and clarify for me the situation here with export controls, because you said maybe we can't really use it now. Maybe take one step back. I think what Dylan talked about is, first of all, the legitimate fabricators of the chips, they'll recognize this as the hack design, so they're not going to produce it, or we at least expect that's part of the respect that would be had, and they wouldn't use that, and it would be known to the legitimate semiconductor companies, hey, we're not going to profit off of this stolen material. That's point one. The next point then is, what I wonder is, assuming that this is high-end chips, it would likely fall under something that's already controlled by the Department of Commerce, and it would seem that maybe there's controls already that would apply, or could they be applied in a subsequent way? But you're saying maybe that's not the case here. So can you clarify for me, what do you see as the response?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I failed to make a distinction in sort of the opening. The regulatory gap is within the open source. Regarding the actual technologies themselves, there could be an export control angle here, and I think it kind of this brings it to one of the central issues I think that we're having currently with BIS and within our export control system is these so-called emerging and foundational technologies, and the ability by BIS and the interagency to identify these technologies and then put appropriate controls on them. And in the case of emerging, it's things that are not currently developed, but are going to be potentially important to U.S. national security or foreign policy interests. And within the legislation, it's in the history of it, it's clear that the intent was to find these things very quickly and likely use a unilateral control to make sure that the U.S. government understands what this technology is and what the risks are, and then work with the different multilateral bodies to potentially put a broader control on that technology. And to date, BIS has identified 39 emerging technologies. And interestingly, a lot of these are going through the normal business as usual Boston system, as opposed to applying a unilateral control. I think a unilateral control has only been put on maybe one time. It's called, I think, a 0Y521 control, which allows the U.S. to put on this unilateral control for something so that they can better understand it. Now, I think for today's conversation, the foundational one is critically important. And it's been about 4 years since the Export Control Reform Act was passed, and the U.S. government hasn't identified any foundational technologies. And I think what the Congress was trying to get at that time was there are certain technologies that have been decontrolled, and this was likely done under an assumption that international trade would create greater openings and there's going to be more opportunities and less risks. And in the case of the PRC, there's been a course correction in the last several years of really understanding the significant risks at play with transferring certain types of technologies, even things that might be older. So I'm not certain of the specific dynamics of the NVIDIA instance, but certainly technology up and down the semiconductor supply chain could be controlled. There's been a number of tools and equipment over time that have been decontrolled, where we might need to re-examine whether or not it still makes sense for SMIC. I mean, to go back to what Dylan was talking about of SMIC's ability to make 14 nanometers that can then force their way to building on an exascale high performance computing, and whether or not it still makes sense for SMIC to be able to access those tools, even if at one point we decontrolled them. And I think this was the whole idea behind foundational. is to look back across the EAR 99, which are items that are not currently on the Commerce Control List, but are still subject to Export Administration regulations, and whether, considering China's military civil fusion strategy and their ongoing human rights abuses, it still makes sense for those types of technologies to be decontrolled. And unfortunately, in 4 years, we haven't made a lot of progress.
Well, thank you for making that point. It is something that we have tried to highlight at China Tech Threat with regard to the Bureau of Industry and Security and in the Department of Commerce. You're referencing, of course, the 2018 major reform of Export Control Act, and the updates to the export control regime. And one of the complaints here is that the BIS has just not done the job that Congress has asked, which was to identify these technologies. And of course, they've come back and said, well, it's very difficult. AI is not one thing. This is all very challenging. But here you have a situation where these are just real world things we can identify, and there's a reluctance in BIS. So what I would just at least highlight is I think Congressman McCall has really been leading the charge here in every possible way, trying to reach out to Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, reminding Department of Commerce how important this is. It hasn't happened. It needs to happen, that we have existing laws on the books. They've got to be strengthened and tightened for exactly the reasons that, they go right into the hands of the Chinese military. So we have some of these letters posted on China Tech Threat. And I might add, in terms of BIS, they have been now without a confirmed head for quite a few years. I mean, of course, there's been, adept people working in an acting capacity, but presently the nominee is held up by his own party on the Democrat side. So to me, it's like one of the most critical roles in the U.S. government with regard to national security isn't being filled, and is certainly not from Mr. McCall has been trying to push it forward. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And to go back quickly to the previous question that I failed to point out is there are actually in the ability to use an induced control in these instances where we find that a Chinese company has stolen intellectual property or is misusing intellectual property, and we can put them on the entity list. And that company can be denied the export of U.S. controlled items or any item subject to the Export Administration regulations. And there is precedent for doing this. The U.S. government used an induced control on Fujian Jinhua over stolen intellectual property from Micron. So there's a lot of flexibility within the current regime to take a lot of strong action. It's a matter of whether or not the U.S. government has the motivation to do that. And then in terms of the current position and not being filled, I mean, it certainly would be beneficial to have leadership at BIS that can help direct the institution to fulfill its congressional mandates, including the emerging and foundational technologies and more aggressive entity listings. And having that political leadership to set forth that mission is very important. I will say, we may be critical of BIS at times. It's been amazing to watch the speed that the government has used with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And really overnight, export control is being put on the entire economy of Russia and very tight export controls on military end users in Russia. And the one thing I would specifically highlight is the diplomatic efforts to work with partners and allies to put in place similar types of policies. And despite not having an undersecretary in place, the BIS has performed very well at engaging with partners and allies, explaining the concerns, explaining the things that can be done, and then getting at least commitments, nominal commitments, to put in place substantially similar policies. So while leadership at BIS would be a tremendous value I'd hope that there's still that muscle memory in place, and certainly leadership from Secretary Raimondo to sort of push from the top that these things matter and need to get done.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's a great point, and you're absolutely right. I think that many agencies in the U.S. government have risen to the occasion, and sometimes a crisis does put people into action. I think the critique has been some sort of lethargy or slowness on moving on China, and yet we can see things can turn around on a dime when it's come to Russia. Now there's a very serious situation. I want to turn to Dylan here for just a moment because I think right off the bat, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was sorry for that back. I'll ask the question and then we'll just edit this out and then I'll see what's happening on my side. But right off the bat, export controls were put on the ability of Russia to acquire semiconductor technologies. How significant is it in your view? And is Russia even a player in the semiconductor market?
So Russia does have quite a bit of expertise related to, mathematics and science, hard sciences, just from a lot of the investment that the Soviet Union made. So companies like Intel do have, employees in Russia, right? And so do many other firms. But as far as manufacturing semiconductors, they're not really involved. They are involved in the supply chain. So that is one aspect, right? In terms of metals and gases. Um, but the impact of these sanctions on Russia is not going to be on, at least on a semiconductor standpoint, an electronic standpoint. It's not going to be as large as many people believe. Simply because they're going to be able to secure these electronics from Chinese companies anyways, and many of these Chinese companies would be, buying American or other Western chips and then integrating them and then it'd go through a complex supply chain of various distributors all the way till it does get to Russia. So I don't think this is going to really lock them out of a lot of American technology, at least on the hardware semiconductor side. Um, the impact of their removal and the sanctions on them on the semiconductor supply chain are quite kind of grim, right? So it's been reported on quite a bit in various media about the neon supply chain. And neon being a gas that's used within lithography, which is a critical step in semiconductor manufacturing. 50 to 60% of neon comes from Ukraine and Russia. And so the alarm bells have been sounded. I was in a Nikkei Asia article, sort of assuaging those fears. The semiconductor supply chain isn't going to shut down because of this. There's, enough supply and, things we can do to recycle neon that'll make it so it's not too much of an issue. But these are times where a time like this where the neon supply chain in Russia and Ukraine is under threat. Something where the U.S. should immediately leap into action and say, "Hey, we can do that here in the U.S." It's actually not that complex. It's air separator units with it, embedded within steel mills. Let's push this type of production. But instead, it's going all the new neon gas production is just going to be put in Japan and China rather than the U.S. because the U.S. just doesn't either highlight these items or doesn't care enough to have supply chain security. So things like that. It's a potential where the U.S. could have had higher supply chain security, but rather it's instead just trading from Russian and Ukrainian dominance of this specific gas to another jurisdiction, which is also just as concentrated on a geographic standpoint, and just as and maybe vulnerable as well.
Well, thank you, Dylan. I think that that's very insightful. Um, let's turn to you, Daniel. We've seen a lot of reports around U.S. tech companies that have just left Russia in mass. Huge McDonald's shuttering hundreds of stores, Apple Computer no longer doing Visa, MasterCard no longer doing payments. The whole HP and Dell not selling the laptops. So pretty amazing, and nothing that the U.S. government necessarily directed. It was pretty much their own choice. So I'm curious to get your reaction on that and how you see that is, how does that help hinder the cause? And then interestingly enough, a lot of the Chinese tech firms are staying. So, for example, Huawei has not slowed one bit in China, and also like Lenovo, which would be a competitor to HP and Dell, they're still selling their laptops. You know, DD, which is the Uber competitor, they wanted to leave, and then there was backlash in China. So, you know, we have the Chinese companies staying in Russia and continuing to operate. So, what does this say, and sort of what is your view on this development?
That's a great question, and Dylan could probably answer some of these much better than me, but I'll take a shot. I think for the U.S. companies, the Russian market is comparatively small, and when juxtaposed to the significant sanctions and likelihood that more sanctions will follow, the political, legal, and regulatory risk likely outweighed the potential market for a lot of these U.S. companies, and they decided to leave the market. China's going to be in a different situation, or their companies are going to be in slightly a different situation. And one of the things I pick up on Dylan's points about the export control component of this, when you examine the rule for Russia, there's numerous parts to it. I guess I'd break it down into three main areas. There's U.S. controls on category, I think now more, category 3 through 9 was the initial one, would have policy of denial from the United States. And there is also a foreign direct product rule for this that would have a policy of denial for any items made outside the United States using U.S. technology to manufacture those items that would then be going to the Russian market. And for the military end user, it was all items subject to the EAR that are going to a military end user in the Russian economy would be a policy of denial. And there is also a foreign direct product rule for the MEU rule as well. Now, the interesting distinction here, and again, Dylan probably has more of the technical side of this, is there's a number of GPUs, CPUs, microprocessors that are EAR 99 that are not on the Commerce Control List. So those items would presumably fall outside of the export control rules that the United States has issued. So if a Chinese company were using those types of items that are not controlled, maybe they're things that should be on the foundational technology list, they would not be violating or evading any of our sanctions or export control regimes. So they would be legally allowed to continue to do business in Russia. Obviously, there's a political dynamic that overshadows everything in the PRC economy, frankly, of, I forget the exact date, but, General Secretary Xi and Vladimir Putin signing what amounts to almost an authoritarian manifesto and a relationship that has no limits. And reporting more recently on U.S. attempts to share intelligence with the PRC, explaining the pending invasion, and at least according to reports, the PRC then turning that over to Russia and not really doing much other than to ask that the invasion occur after the Olympics. And you're seeing sort of a tightening between these two countries and their strategic position. So what sort of pressure that PRC companies may be under to evade or violate the U.S. sanctions regime? Obviously, the PRC government has said clearly that they disagree with the use of these sanctions. They have anti-sanctions law and blocking statutes that if coercion, sub rosa coercion wasn't sufficient, then they could also legally require the company and the PRC to transfer that technology. The broader point here too is U.S. ability to identify these violations and evasions. Maybe last week, Assistant Secretary Axelrod from BIS Export Enforcement talked about the number of export control officers that they have stationed overseas. It's 9, and there's 2 in the PRC. And from what I understand, end-use checks of controlled technology in the PRC is incredibly difficult. You have to get permission from the PRC government in order to inspect a facility to ensure that that company is complying with the terms of their license. And the concern, obviously, is if you have to seek the approval of the PRC government, and this takes time, that you wouldn't get an actual, you wouldn't be able to see exactly what the company was doing, that there's a concern that information could be falsified. And so I guess the question then becomes, are we going to be able to see all the different ways that PRC companies continue to engage in the Russian economy, whether legally or illegally, is going to be a huge question mark. And then the next question is, what does the US government then do in response?
Well, thank you for bringing in those points. In fact, it's something that China Tech Threat has mentioned in one of its future of BIS recommendations, that staffing is an issue. Exactly this challenge around export control officers, that maybe BIS looks at a fraction of 1% of all the trade, of all the exports. So as smart as they try to be and as intelligent, there's also a question about the number of people. And I think this is something that Congress probably has some sensitivity to. So, well, let's bring in Dylan again, so we have something where the three of us can talk, because we've covered this issue with Russia and China is really something, and clearly, the NVIDIA materials could also be of interest to Russian actors as well. And now being a pariah state, why would they care of no one's going to be checking them, if you will. Whether or not they can fabricate may be another question. But so Dylan, from your side, what other things do you want to add to our discussion here that might be important to take into account? And again, I'm not insinuating that NVIDIA hack had anything to do with Russia and Ukraine.
Sure. So, a lot of this conversation has been about what, punitive actions can be done to prevent U.S. technology from falling into the hands of bad actors. The punitive actions that we can do are numerous, and, perhaps the government has not, done them to the proper extent that they could, wielded the full force. But what could be, what also, the other side of the coin needs to be looked at, which is, here's the stick. We can block exports. We can look more deeply at what we're exporting in order to make sure this technology is not falling into the bad hands. But what about the carrot, right? Teddy Roosevelt's carrot and stick. What is the carrot here? And there is this constant flow of American and Western companies partnering and doing joint ventures in China, because economically it makes the most sense for them. But one of the things that we haven't really discussed too much is what can we do on the flip side of the coin with semiconductor companies to prevent what's happened to so many numerous other industries. In the West, what can we do to prevent that happening to the semiconductor industry? And we need that carrot, right? The CHIPS Act, doesn't have, it should be, money regarding, the semiconductor industry, helping us there. But also there should be, guidelines and rails there, right, where it says, hey, you cannot do these sorts of partnerships with China. You cannot, transfer IP to a joint venture. You cannot, do these things that would weaken American technology dominance, right? And you can smack down, the semiconductor companies and semiconductor equipment companies by saying, hey, you can't do it, but you also have to provide them the other outlet, right? Which is, hey, what about we're gonna help you get those same sales that you're missing out in China, in the U.S. or in Europe. And so that's something that we really haven't talked about, right? Why hasn't the CHIPS Act passed yet? Why doesn't the CHIPS Act have, guardrails against China? This is just like, something that I think is fairly common sense and should have happened already, but it's just lingering and lingering and lingering. Yeah.
That's a great point about the CHIPS Act, Dylan. Thank you for raising that. It is one of the critiques, that there's a lot of money in the CHIPS Act, but there's not necessarily expected measures. What we give you $50 billion, what should you be able to do? And that there should be more controls on that. Dylan, Daniel, this is also your department. You probably know a thing or two about the CHIPS Act and have probably proposed amendments and have ideas. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a really great point that Dylan mentioned about the carrot and stick approach. And from the start, I think for Representative McCall, Ranking Member McCall, is the idea of a promote protect strategy. Now, Ranking Member McCall has been very vocal on the export control side of things that we need to do to shore up our national security with respect to technology transfers. But he was also one of the lead architects on the Chips for America funding and worked very closely with the previous administration and Senator Cornyn, as well as Representative Matsui, and I believe Representative Senator Warner on the Senate to put together that package and to get it done with a lot of speed. It was amazing to see how quickly that piece of legislation was able to get authorized on the National Defense Authorization Act. Key question now is the appropriations and getting the money, the $52 billion to the executive branch, and that still remains a work in progress. But Dylan and Roslyn, you both mentioned the issue of guardrails, which is significant. And not to get too sort of in the weeds on congressional procedures, but when the Competes Act was at the Rules Committee, Rep. McCall and Rep. Gallagher offered an amendment to put guardrails on the CHIPS funding so that the money couldn't be used by PRC entities, and also put certain types of restrictions on what companies taking CHIPS money would be able to do in China. Unfortunately, that amendment was not adopted, but I think there continues to be a lot of folks in Congress who are now very aware of the issue, and as things move into conference potentially between USICA and Competes, I think the guardrail issue is still going to be a top priority. And I guess the follow-up question is this enough? And I think from our perspective is, at least on the CHIPS funding, it's just the first step. And one of the big next moves that we need to get done is the refundable investment tax credit. And the grant funding will be valuable in kickstarting U.S. production. And it seems like a lot of large foundries and manufacturers are looking at what the U.S. is preparing and planning investments within the United States, whether it's TSMC in Arizona, Intel in Ohio, or Samsung in Texas. And the hope would be get the money out there, but then put in place this investment tax credit that can provide more of a long-term predictability and U.S. government support for this industry. Because at the moment, there's a lot of other countries that are also looking at semiconductors and understanding its strategic importance, both for national security and economic competitiveness. And I think sort of the next evolution of this, which hopefully has been spurred along by maybe one of the very few silver linings of what's going on around the world, is really this need to work with a small group of partners and allies around semiconductors from sand to silicon, and to be able to shore up the supply chain to make sure that the manufacturing is occurring and from sort of the extraction of raw materials to the advanced testing and packaging at the end of it, that it's occurring in other democratic countries with rule by law, the same sort of value set that we have. Secure that supply chain in those countries. You're then able to put in place more unified export control policies on what the PRC economy can then access. What sort of chips would they be able to get? At this point, I think everyone is sort of running in their own lanes, and the PRC has $150 billion going toward this, and massive investments by YMTC and SMIC, who continue to gain access to a lot of cutting edge tools and equipment and software. And I think there needs to come a point where we think about this industry much more strategically and use all the tools available, export controls, incentives, grant programs, tax credits, all of these things to make sure that this industry, we're supporting the companies, we're giving them the money that they might lose from having access to the China market, but also shoring up our national security and long term that we're not going to be dependent on the PRC for a significant amount of chips. I mean, we've seen sort of the hiccup in supply chains on what it's done for the auto sector. And that should really bring home of like, if we can't access chips, it goes beyond just the IT companies. It starts to affect really potentially any industry. And then it gets down to like the workers within those industries and the congressional districts that are supposed to be helping these people find, stable employment. So the more that we can keep the supply chain in other countries where we're going to have predictability, we're going to have trust that when things go bad, we have trust that we're going to maintain these supply chains for each other, the better. Because I think, and sorry to keep going on, but I think the COVID crisis really brought that home of how much trust is important to international commerce. And that trust broke down when, countries like the PRC were putting in place export restrictions on masks. We're using United Front organizations to buy up the global supply of masks and then send them back to the PRC. And now they're dominant in the mask industry for certain types of K95 masks. And you sort of see the play out and start thinking about how this could apply to other industries.
Well, thank you for that, Daniel. And believe me, we can have you on many times. We'll just take one industry at a time. Today, we covered so much ground. We've talked about the NVIDIA hack. We have talked about what's going on in Russia and China with regard to American companies and export controls. We've also talked about the CHIPS Act. So this has been really a great session. Is there anything else that you want to add to your NVIDIA discussion, or anything else that we talked about?
Yeah, so just on Daniel's point that I wanted to follow up on. So following up on his point was he mentioned that Daniel mentioned there needs to be a longer term solution, not only just a one-time 50 billion, right, which doesn't even match what China's doing, by the way, but there needs to be a longer term, investment credit, right, that he mentioned. The investment credits are actually sort of something similar is built into Taiwanese and South Korean law. Japan just recently also pushed something through. China has, that obviously as well, and more. So there needs to be some longer term, stabilization where the American, chip companies and companies investing in America have similar benefits and incentives as they do in other jurisdictions. Otherwise, you'll just see companies like, Micron, which is an American company, continue to build all their fabs in Singapore and Taiwan rather than in the US, because it doesn't make economic sense to here due to the difference in tax laws and regulations related to permitting and environmental and things of that nature. So there needs to be something done in that regard in order to equal the playing field. And the CHIPS Act is not enough alone.
This has been really great session for all of our listeners, learning so much in just a short period of time. I really want to thank Daniel Markus from the U.S. House China Task Force, staffer to Representative Michael McCall of Texas. Thank you so much, Daniel. And also I want to thank Dylan Patel of Semi-Analysis, leading semiconductor analyst and friend of China Tech Threat. Both of you, thank you so much. And we'll speak again soon.